if you use AI to generate your code and use a tool like Windsurf or Cursor.sh, you probably run into some issues where it keeps generating the wrong code or introducing mistakes into your code base. So in this video, I'm going to show you guys what you can do in order to give enough context to your AI so that it's able to actually have a really good understanding of your code and make less mistakes, don't break your functionalities, and also introduce less error to your code base. So I want to start first by saying that context is everything. And if you don't give enough context, your code won't be able to actually know what it needs to do. And that can be simply illustrated by, for example, if you were in ChatGPT and you were to type, where's the signing file, you probably won't get the right outcome because it has no idea what file you're referring to, doesn't know where it's located, and wouldn't know what to do. But if you go into an app like, for example, Windsurf, that has a really good context of your code base, and you were to type, where's the signing file, it will look at your code base, look for a file that is named signing file, and it found it and would let you know what it knows about it and where it's located. And you could do the same thing on a tool like Cursor. I'm not sure if Cursor is as good at doing it because it doesn't have a really good context of your files in your code base. But, so you probably struggle to do that unless you provide him the file. So look, right now, we're going to see what it's doing right now, but it's trying to look for the file. As you can see, it's taking a lot longer than Windsurf because Windsurf was built with really, really good context of your code base. And I think prioritizing the app that has the most context is really important in AI because number one rule of AI, right? Garbage in, garbage out. So like you want to make sure that what's coming in has enough context so you can be able to have a really good output in general. So as you can see, this is still struggling, can't really figure out where the file is. But in here, if I were to actually give him the file, obviously he has the context and he'll be able to like log in and figure it out, right? I can just do something like this and it's going to be a lot easier for him to look for it. Yeah, so I just wanted to illustrate the difference between Windsurf and Cursor, which is a simple example. Windsurf has a much better context, and in this video, I'm going to explain you how to provide better context by using Windsurf. All right, so first of all, you need to understand how context work. So when you're using a prompt in general, it gives you local context. It only has local context of what you're giving it. And if you add a snippet of your code, then now you're giving it limited context. So it knows a little bit more what it needs to do with that limited context. But if it has access to your entire code base, now you're giving it global context. And the more context it's able to have, the less likely it's about to make guesses and mistakes about your code and assumption. So your goal is essentially to reduce the number of assumption by making sure that it has full context of what it needs to do. But obviously you don't have to give him everything at once because it's not a problem of quantity, it's more of a problem of making sure that you're giving the right content, so more quality, that he needs to look at the time that he's actually analyzing what he's trying to solve. And you can think about context like this, where when you have local context only looking at this single dot, and a limited context only get access to different dots around it. So think about it like your brain and the different neurons that it has. And the more dot that you have, the more context it gets. But having more neuron doesn't automatically mean that the brain is smarter. It's more about how well those neurons work together. So you can think about it like, for example, in a big city, and when you don't have a lot of roads that are well connected, then the productivity in the city are inefficient. But if you have like highways and nice road, then the productivity is a lot more smooth. So it's not about having more neuron. Actually, elephants have more neuron than humans, but our neurons are more interconnected together, and that's what we're able to. We are smarter than elephant and other animals and so on. So this is why I was saying like it's very important to give it the right context, not all the context at once, but the right context when it's doing its job. So essentially, right now, I believe that GitHub Copilot has less context than Cursor.sh, and Cursor.sh has less context than Windsurf. Windsurf right out the box has really good context about all the files in your code base. And there's a way to give Cursor more context of the code base. You can use a tool like Tree, where essentially, I'm going to show you a quick example. You can just type, for example, 3 like this, and then exclude the file that you don't want, and you will give him context of the code base of your files. You can just copy this output that shows how your files are organized and just give it to Cursor, and it will have like an idea about how to manage those files. So that's one way you can give it more context with the file. Now, I'm going to show you what I've did here is that I've created a tool that allow me to, I would say more like a framework that allow me to give a lot more context to my codes. And I usually start by doing code analysis. And the way I do that is just, I have everything over here. So I use this code here, and I'm going to put this link in the description below. But essentially you copy this, and you can start by, for example, picking a file. So I'm going to do this example with Cursor right now. So let's say I'm going to pick a file. Don't have a backend right here, but you can, for example, pick this one, and you can just paste. Let me pick something that is more like authentication. I think this is going to be an example that I'm ready to if you want. And you can just paste that. Analyze the following code. Identify the main objective. Break down each key component, function, classes, loops, and conditional, and explain how data flows from input to output. This is the core functionality that should not be broken, and explain how different components are connected. Then identify any potential risks for breaking these functionalities during code changes. So if you send that, usually I love to use it for backend code because I have a different one that I use for my UI and UX, but I just wanted to show you an example. If you were to put this right here, you can please put it there, and it's going to essentially analyze all your code and give you a full breakdown of how your code works. So I have a different set of prompts that I can pass in that I'll show you after. And usually I like to use this code analysis first so that it has good context about the application before I start using those ones. There's been cases where I use some of the prompt that I posted on these ones, but I find that doing the first analysis first give it really good context of what it's about to do for the next run when I'm giving it more context. This is taking some time here, a bit longer than expected, but let's try to do that with a file on the back end over here. So I'm going to take, for example, search repo, which is a feature that I have in my app kit cleanse, and I'm going to paste this, and let's see what it's about to generate. So right away it's about to generate something. So see, searching the repo. Windsurf give you what it's doing along the line, so it shows you what file it's analyzing, give you a brief summary of what's happening. And as you see, this prompt allow you to get the key component that you have in your code, repository validation. This is the data flow that's happening with my logic. It also tells you the core functionality. It lists them down one by one. The data flow that you have, input, processing, output, the component connection, potential risk, and so on and so on and so on. So this is a really good analysis of your code right off the box. And you're not going to use that. What I'm going to show you is how I'm able to use all my prompt and come up with something like this, where I have, for example, core functionality that I tagged with do not alter this function, which is very important because the only way for the AI to be aware of what it needs to avoid, not to touch or not to modify, is to have a clear understanding of what are your core functionalities. And you can do that by just literally tagging those core functionality and telling the AI, these are my core functionality, do not touch them. And it has this context when modifying the code. And as you can see, it also has a description of what the core functionality does. And I always provide input, so telling it like what this thing is going to receive and what is this is going to output. Very, very important. Also, I give it context about the error responses and where this function is called. Because when it's looking at this code right away, it doesn't really have context of where else in the application this function is being called, unless it's actually triggering a search to figure that out. So rather than having the AI making that search, I just provide it right away from here so that it has context of where the method is being called. If, for example, it decides to modify one part of my code without the context that something else is using it. So now it has that context, so it's not going to make that mistake. I also give it the entry points and then the exit points so that it has an understanding of where the data flow starts and where it ends. And that's happening for each of the different component or part of my code that are using this specific function. And then as you can see, as we go down the stack, we also have, let's see, I'm going to look at my note. We also have the processing chain. So you say step 1, for example, what's happening on step 1, step 2. So the processing chain allow it to, because when he's looking at your code, he doesn't really have context of what's step 1, what's step 2, what's step 3, but is allow it to have a breakdown of what you're actually trying to do at each step. So think about it like when you have pseudocode and you writing a pseudocode before you write your code, so you're saying exactly what you're doing at each different component in this application. So it will know, for example, when you're mentioning, for example, I'm having trouble, the repository is not validating the path correctly. It will know that this is happening within this code base right here. And if, for example, you're saying something such as, oh, I'm having some issue with my repository search path, it will know that it's happening over here. So it's getting context of the functional chain of your code, and specifically with functions. And I'm doing that with almost every single code that I'm working with. So you see, it's going to give you the step 1, step 2, step 3, and so on and so on. After the processing chain comment, I'm taking care of in-function variables comments. And that's essentially giving more description of what each variable is actually doing, because it doesn't really have that context right out of the box. And that's what I noticed, because sometimes it makes assumption about the purpose of this variable just based on the name. And I want to make sure that it's avoiding that. So the solution I figured was to give it context for each variable. So like now, for example, he knows that here he's going to use that to command keyword with search parameter, and you get like a lot of context about each of the variable that we're using and what they're used for. Because if you have multiple variable called response, all he knows is that it's giving a response, but he doesn't know what the response is giving. So I'm making sure to give him all this context right off the box. And then you have data flow context. Again, like what are all the entry points and what are all the exit points. So he knows where the data is coming in, what the data looks like when it's coming in, and what the data looks like when it's exiting and providing the response. And obviously the core functionality tagging, which I've been doing in all of my main codes, for example right here, so it's aware that you should not modify the core functionality. Now, if you want to give it UI UX context, this is a little bit different. What you have to do here is I'm using this little prompt right here. And before I do that, let me just quickly show you. So if you just click right here, you'll see the full prompt that I just explained, what it's doing behind the scene. It's already good and ready to go. So you can literally just copy that. And the way I do that is I just copy the prompt right here and come here, paste it over here, and I make sure to specify what file this is, just for more context. Sometimes you don't need to do that, but I make sure to specify that this is for this file. And then after that, you will just generate all the comment that you see over here and for you automatically. And the way I do that is by going from 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So I do it in one at a time. It's already ordered in the perfect order for your need. So I highly recommend to do that in this order, so that it first do the input output, then figure out the processing chain, then add the in-function variables, and then figure out the data flow context, and then tag the functionality that are your core functionality. And this is designed so that it only tags functionality that looks like core functionality for you. But when it's not doing that for you, you can also just copy this thing and add that at the top of a function or method that you're deemed core functionality to make sure that it does not modify it. And later on I explain some rules that you can pass to ensure that it doesn't actually modify that. Okay, so now moving on to UI UX. This is the prompt I use for the UI UX. So it does something similar as above, but this is specifically designed to ensure that it doesn't modify my UI UX. Because what I've noticed is that oftentimes I ask it to change a feature, and sometimes it completely changes the UI UX of my feature. Sometimes I'm happy, I'm like, oh my God, I did not expect it to look that cool. But then I want it to maintain that, or like sometimes it gets exactly what I want and I don't want it to change, right? And the solution that I came up with is this thing right here. And this thing is able to essentially generate all of this comment description that you're seeing over here. It gives you a description of what this company is doing, what are the input, what are the different states, outputs, the event handling, UI states. It just give you more description than what you will actually get in the code. And when it's analyzing the file, it gets all this context right out of the box. So not only the name of the state, but what the state is used for. And that gives additional context. And yeah, so data flow, integration points, dependencies, and limits, if there's any limit that exists. Because sometimes when you generate codes and I have a constant that is used for that limit, it's not aware that you need to use that specific constant. So that's super helpful for that. And yeah, now that you have that context, you notice that I also have description with different part of the code. Again, the in function variable description, and that one is also super helpful. So this single prompt right here will generate all that for you inside your UI UX component. So the way I've been using that is essentially I go in all my TSX file or any of my component that are front end, and I make sure that that I generate that for all of them, and this way it has a full context of how this works. And I often recommend to use any of the prompt above when you reach a working state. So let's say you've been generating your code and you got to a working state and you don't want things to change or get broken. This is when you should start using that. And then that's when it's effective. Sometimes when you're making changes, you notice that the AI is making mistakes and you want to make sure that it's aware of the mistake that it has made. And this is when you want to use code diff. There's two options. You can do git show or you can do git diff. But each option has advantages and disadvantages. So I would recommend to use git show if you want to see changes on the very specific commits. And I would recommend to use git diff if you want to see uncommitted changes or branch comparison. And you can look at this table over here where I broke down essentially what are the benefits. So for example, if you're using git shows, I'll be able to view changes in a specific commit. Git diff doesn't do it. You'll see only uncommitted changes on git diff, but not in git show. Compare changes between branch. Git show doesn't do that, but git diff does it. But overall, the benefit of using git show is that you're not only showing the diff file, but you're also showing the metadata. So what are the comments that you put on your git commit? And if your git commit are descriptive, it'll know, for example, that, oh, these specific changes were made for the implementation of a new feature or for the optimization of the code. So it has context on what's happening, but it only works really well if you're actually having really descriptive commit. That's why I recommend to do that. I'm personally using AI commit for my commit so that I can get commits right away just by typing AI commits and it generates the commits for me. But it doesn't do that for all of my commits, for like a good chunk of it, but not for all of it. So if you want to give context for a specific commit, you can use this command right here. This one makes sure that the git diff that you're generating is not broken down or truncated. So you make sure that it sees the full thing. Sometimes you'll notice that Windsurf will suggest to look at a diff if you ask it to analyze a diff commit, but it's using git diff. It's not using this long command that actually makes sure that the code that it's analyzing is not truncated. So if you want to make sure you get the full diff context, just copy and paste this command and it'll give it the full context. Now, if you want to get context for a specific file, you just need to append the name of the file at the end and it'll have that context. And finally, you can, for giving context for uncommitted changes, that's the typical git diff that you usually do in your application to see what changed between the saved state and then the current state. And then that's how you just do it. And you guys are all familiar with it, I presume. Okay, so now I want to get to better context with debugging. And that's the last one up. So to give better context in debugging, that's all about the keyword that you use in your phrases. Some keywords that have been very effective with me are data flow, flow of data, processing chain, component hierarchy, expected interface, and expected inputs. And how you can do that is if you just copy some of those texts. For example, when you're facing a bug and you want it to figure out what's happening with the right context, you can ask it to track the data flow to find the issue. And it's going to track the data flow and break things down in part and have a better reasoning of what's happening. You can also ask it to add console log to track the exact flow of data. Super helpful because by doing that, it's going to add console log across your data flow. And when you're looking at the log in your console, you'll be able to just copy that log, paste it into your AI, and it's going to be able to interpret what's happening with a lot more context of the data flow. This is extremely helpful when you have your API communicating with your front end and you want to make sure that no data is lost, or that, for example, that is using the same structure. Because sometimes what I've noticed is it will have different structure from the data at a different point between transformation and output, and it causes a lot of issues because it's not actually matching. So you want to make sure that what's inputted and what's outputted often match, that it's the same interface. And if you want that to happen for your code, this is a good way to find out where the data is being broken. For example, if it's analyzing an object, but it's not going down the right chain, it can create some issues. The next thing you want to do is analyze the processing chain step by step and explain why the issue is happening and then fix it. So what I'm doing here, I'm like, first reason about it, break it down through the processing chain, and then fix it. Then you can also ask it to follow the component hierarchy and analyze how the data is being passed. And it's going to, for example, if you have a component that has child component and the parents and so on, it's going to go through that hierarchy to see how the data is being passed through the props in your React application, and then understand how the data is being transferred. So if you're sending a value from a parent component to a child component, it's going to be able to track things down and see where things are being are broken. But one super helpful thing is when it has context of the input and output, like I've done here. For example, when we're looking at this file right here, it already knows exactly what's coming in and what's coming out, and is able essentially to interpret what it needs to do in order to fix it, because he has a context of this is what's being passed in, this is what's being passed out, and he knows that in order to achieve the result that you want, the objective, these two need to match. And if it doesn't match, and if there's an issue there, he's going to be able to have a clear context of what's happening there in order to figure out where there's some issues. Yes, and then you can continue use the rest of it over here, follow the component hierarchy, expected interface matching, and so on and so on. And then finally, one of the other things that I love to do is triggering reasoning. So if you're trigger reasoning, essentially you're allowing it to really think about each of the issues deeply. And I use this keyword here, recursively, to essentially encourage it to actually question everything it does. So whenever he thinks about something, then he asks himself a recursive question and then goes through this question pattern to essentially uncover more insight about the issue that he's trying to solve before making a final decision and trying to fix it. You can use that. That I found that to be extremely effective. I call it my God prompt. Or you can use the 5 whys. So you ask it to use the 5 whys to ask questions about the issue in order to resolve it. And essentially, it's going to ask why this is happening this way, why, 5 times in order to uncover an issue related to the issue you're trying to fix, and then figure out how to solve it. So this is technically the breakdown of my strategy. Now, one thing that I haven't mentioned here that we're going to cover right away is there are rules that you can introduce. Windsurf has rule, Cursor has rule, and you can access Windsurf rules by going into Windsurf settings at the bottom over here and essentially clicking on edit rules for your global rules, and on edit rules here for your workspace rule. And if you look at my edit rules right here, what I've done here is I have different rules that make sure that it does not modify my core functionality, which I've already tagged. Also, it respects on annotation with the pattern do not alter, because sometimes I might have a core functionality mentioned and do not alter, right? So he's aware that he has to be have a conservative approach about that core functionality. And when I add do not alter, he knows that I do not want it to be altered at all. You need to stay exactly how it is. So whichever you decide to do, need to go around modifying that part of the code. And then you can I have preserved the file's output structure, because oftentimes I've noticed that it changes the output structure of files, which create a lot of issues, because then it's broken down. Then when I'm looking at my front end, it's not displaying the right data because it's not actually accessing the right key. So that helps me avoid that. Maintain data consistency for embedded, clustered, and reference context. Do not remove processing chain comments. So this is all the comment that I generated when you use my processing chain prompt. Always generate code with explicit input and output comment as per the instruction. So what I've done, so the prompt that I showed you, I've went ahead and added it into my instruction directory, where I usually add my PRD and all the information that I want my code to have context to. And if you look over here, I've added the entire prompt right here so that it has context about what is an input and output, because in the file, I actually explain it. I would say when are input and output useful, when input and output command are not useful, and I give him a full context of that. Also, it has my processing chain inputs. So what does the LLM actually needs, how to write comments, comment formats, examples. So I've just break it down for it. So this is when it's looking at the rule, it can refer to that file in order to get more context related to those rules. And then as you can see, I even have more stuff. I have a typo right here. Always generate the code within function variable description. Just so I don't have to essentially run my prompt all the time, is that whenever I generate new code, then it edit the old variable description and generate new ones to make sure that it always matches the new generated code. Do not tag the code core functionality unless explicitly requested. I'm doing that because from analyzing my code, it has tried to repeat that pattern and mark some of the new generated code core functionality when they weren't. So I've made sure to add that. And when you update the code, if the input and output processing chain command are changed, please use the instruction in this file in order to figure out what you need to do moving forward. So this is where you do that in a Windsurf setting. And in Cursor, this is actually in your settings. So you have to head over settings, Cursor settings, and then you have rules right here, rules for AI. I haven't added anything here yet because I don't use Cursor as much as I used to. And you can see that there's also a Cursor rules file that you can include, similarly to Windsurf rules, where you can give it more context into that file. Cursor also has an extra feature that actually allows you to add a test. Technically, what you need to do if it's running test things. I forgot how to access it. But yeah, this is something else that you can use if you want to give it more like a context about how it should test the code that it's actually generating. You also have the workspace rules. Those are my workspace rules. As you can see here, I also specify the core functionality that I don't want it to modify. And I tell it exactly what it should not modify. So do not change the UI UX, make conservative changes to the code, do not break functionality of the app. Very important to do that because you don't want it to just start making assumptions. So like when you write a prompt and you just start saying, oh, by the way, I think doing this might also be great. I don't want it to do that. So instead, what you can do is say, only make conservative changes, but tell me about the suggestion that could improve my code. This way it doesn't automatically changes your code. When asked to perform a specific task, do not remove console log, which happened a lot to me. Do not remove comment, and do not remove unrelated code. Often happen where you ask it to do something, and it goes ahead and modify something else in your code because it thinks it just noticed something else right while looking at the code and decide to make a modification. And that's how you prevent that. I have other rules that are more specific to my use case for my app, but you can use a similar format and mention your core functionalities like this. I have a name, description of what it does, and then I'll list the prohibited changes over here. And because it has all the context that we've given it through in-function variable, functional chain, input and output, and data flow, it will know exactly what core functionality you're referring to, because those core functionality also have a description that specify what they're doing. So if they're doing embedding generation, it will have context of that inside of the command. So this is my personal workflow. It's been extremely helpful for me. I've dealt with an issue for a couple of weeks where I wasn't able to actually fix the code because it kept making the same mistakes. And when I would fix one part of the code, it would introduce a mistake elsewhere because it was modifying my core functionality. So I found that this strategy was my way for me to tell it to stop doing that. And you have to think about it as like when you're working with someone in a team, and let's say you're working with another developer and you're telling it to do a specific task. If you don't get into the detail of what it needs to do, then you need to figure out a lot of things on their own. So what you want to do is give him enough context so that the developer is able to do the fix needed in order to implement the change. Okay, super helpful to make sure to mention all your core functionality. This way you get a full context about what you want modified, and this is why it's been super helpful to do that in the code. If you enjoyed this video, you might also like this other video right here or right here that is about how to give more context in Superbase, or if you're working with a database, you can reapply the same concept that I've done with Superbase to essentially other database type. But this is kind of what I've been using in order to make sure that it has all the context you need when working with database. I hope that was helpful. Make sure to hit subscribe if you like this content.